Hi, my name is Shauna Jean. Thank you so much for being part of this class, Building a Better Toolbox. I've been teaching this class for probably 13 or 14 years on behavior management. This is our first time doing this together online, so thank you in advance for your flexibility and for your patience. So one of the big changes that I've seen in the time that I've been teaching this class and the time that I've been a BCBA supporting different classrooms is a couple of things, and they're both related to the same main point. Number one is we're seeing more kids who are not identified through an IEP. Where when I first started out in the field, the kids I was seeing for behavior challenges were kids who were diagnosed with autism or developmental delay, but they were identified. They were our IEP kids, and they were having behavior challenges, and those are the kids that I was focused on. And what we're seeing over the past 3, 4 years or so is we've got this group of kids coming up and they're not diagnosed, or they go through testing and they don't qualify for services, but teachers are saying there's something. They have challenges with anxiety, they have challenges with mood regulation, they have challenges with body regulation. And those are kids who don't necessarily come with any services. But those are kids still who are taking up a lot of time for the teacher. So as we're tweaking this class, we're really starting to think about how do we serve kids who aren't necessarily identified and for whom there aren't other kinds of assistance coming in to help you. And so the way that I've been thinking about behavior management over the past few years is really focusing much more on antecedent management as opposed to responsive management. So what we're going to be doing is thinking about what are the things that could go wrong? What are the things that might impact 3, 4, 5 of the kids in your classroom? And how do we sort of get ahead of those behaviors using specific language and specific systems that predict that those behaviors are going to happen? And we just change the way that we're teaching, the way that we think about things in terms of behavior on an antecedent level, as opposed to a response-based system, which might look like if John does his work over the course of 20 minutes, he gets a token. And when he gets 5 tokens, he can trade in for this. Or when Mary is safe, she gets a check. And when she gets 5 checks, she can trade in for this. And those kinds of systems, while very beneficial for our kids, it's hard to manage when you've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids in a classroom who need that kind of a system. And it's really hard to do that if there's a teacher and one support person in your classroom. So as we're going through this class, this first module gets us thinking about special ed law and the diagnoses that we might be looking at, and really looking at what do we want to change in terms of behavior and starting to get specific. So we just talked about the kinds of kids that we're seeing, and I see a lot of kids now with anxiety. And when we go to think about behavior change, what's the behavior that you want to change? And what I hear is, I want him to be less anxious, or I want him to be happier. I want her to be safer on the playground. Those are all really good goals, but they're not necessarily behaviors. And so what we're doing in this module is we're starting to pinpoint what are the 3 behaviors. Behavior is observable and measurable. What are 3 behaviors that as a teacher you've been seeing over the past year, maybe more, or behaviors that you're predicting you might be seeing next year? And how do we get ahead of that by being really specific in terms of that behavior? So there's some work in that first module that gets into that, creating an operational definition. The one other thing that I want to talk about is this idea of the behavioral trap. And so when we look to change behavior, we're not actually changing the behavior. We're changing what we do or what we set up before the behavior has a chance to happen, and then we change how we respond to the behavior. It's the antecedent and the consequence piece, as opposed to actually physically changing the behavior when it's going on. And so we're going to be talking about in the second module a lot of like, how do we change our antecedent approach? How do we predict behavior and change change the way that we're thinking about behavior, talking about behavior before it happens. And then the third module will be about how do we respond to behavior when it does, and that gets a little bit more into the functional analysis or the functional assessment piece. Here's the trap. once people read about antecedent behavior consequence or they hear about it, it's pretty easy to understand. Like, yep, there's something that happens before behavior. Yep, there's the behavior. Yep, there's a consequence. And that consequence that happens over a period of time can really start to cement a cycle where when the antecedent happens, the behavior is more likely to happen. Kind of once you read that, and you'll read about that in the module, it's pretty simple to understand. And you can see it like reading it, like, well, of course I wouldn't inadvertently reinforce behavior, such as yelling in the classroom, or I wouldn't inadvertently reinforce behavior such as saying mean things to other kids. Of course I wouldn't. The behavioral trap is that there isn't just a behavioral continuum for students, there is a behavioral continuum for teachers, which means antecedent behavior consequence for the student. The behavior of the student is the antecedent for the teacher. And the consequence for the student is often led by the behavior of the teacher. And then there is a consequence for the teacher. So a pretty common example is there's someone in your class and you present math, and math is a triggering activity for that child. And so when it's time for math class, the child engages in lots of nuisance behavior or protest behavior. That's the child's behavior. It's your antecedent as a teacher. And when you are presented with that antecedent, our behavior often or commonly is to tell the child to take a walk or to send them to the principal's office, something that gets them out of the classroom. And the child says, sure, I'll leave the room. I'll go to the principal's office. Sure. And looking back, we say, wait a minute. Every time it's math class, the child engages in some behavior, and then I send them out of the room. I wonder if that child is acting out in order to leave the room. The behavioral trap is that as a teacher, we are just as, it's just as easy for us to get caught into a behavioral cycle as it is for our kids. So our antecedent is hearing behavior or seeing behavior in the classroom. Our behavior is to send that child out of the room, and then our consequence is a short period of peace and quiet, or a classroom that seems more organized or is easier to teach in. So we're reinforced as teachers by delivering consequences to kids that we sort of know aren't going to lead to long-term improvements in behavior, but in the short term, it buys us 20 minutes or it buys us 30 minutes of what feels like the ability to teach the rest of the class. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit as we go on. As we're moving through our classes, I am available on email. I can be available on text or by phone or by chatting in person. I'm around a lot over the summer. I'm happy to meet with you. So please be in touch with me. Ask any and all questions that come up. If you have examples that you want to think about or you want us to be thinking about as we go through the classroom, send them. We're going to have a blog. We're going to have a place where everyone can start to introduce themselves to one another and communicate. If you can send the information about what you're going through, there might be 3 or 4 other people who already have been down that road and have some ideas as to how to help. And we can use some of those examples to frame the work that we're doing. Okay, so thank you so much. It's nice to meet everybody, and have fun.